I'd like to talk to you today about my very favorite subject, and it has been for the last 3 years, which is Egyptian coffins from the site of Akhmim. But first, a little introduction here. So after the end of the New Kingdom, the coffin became the most important element of an elite burial. And this is because Egyptians started to be buried in undecorated communal tombs. And so the coffin took on a lot of the decoration that would have gone on the tomb walls, and the rest of the burial equipment was very heavily reduced. And so the coffin kind of also shared function with Book of the Dead scrolls, which did or did not occur in a lot of elite burials. And so Egyptians went to their hereafter in these extravagantly decorated nests of multiple coffins. And this is really, it was not only the most colorful part of the burial, it was also probably the most intimate part of the burial because it was directly around the body of the deceased. And the vignettes and the text on the coffins were strategically selected and placed on the surface of the coffin. And they acted as a womb through which the deceased could be reborn into the next life. They acted as like a universe in the box where the lid of the coffin sometimes took on the symbolism of the sky, and the basin of it took on symbolism of the underworld. And so basically the coffin acted, it functioned as a tomb, as a recreation of the universe, as basically this vessel through which the deceased would be reborn. And so the decoration on it was functional, and as were the texts. But our understanding of coffin development and decoration comes almost entirely from Theban coffins. And this is because we have several large caches of coffins from Thebes, which came from more or less well-documented find contexts. With Theban coffins, the owners tend to be people who were attested elsewhere on other monuments, and who recorded, who have dates associated with their burial that allow us to associate them with a particular king in a particular regnal year. So most studies have focused on Theban coffins, and most have focused on charting the overall changes in decorative layout rather than the contexts of the iconography and text. And most of them have worked towards the end of dating coffins. And the results have been fruitful. So we have this a pretty solid model of how coffins developed. So roughly based on these Theban examples. And so we have in the 21st dynasty, we have these very shiny yellow coffins that get more and more complex as the dynasty progresses. And then at the end of the 21st dynasty, these end up getting replaced by cartonages, which are like paper mache shells that go around the body that lace up the back. And the decoration on these gets a lot simpler, but it's also very, very colorful. And these cartonages are placed in outer coffins that are plain and just have a central inscription on them. And then at the end of the third intermediate period and the beginning of the Nubian period, the 25th dynasty, the cartonages start to be replaced by these coffins that have pedestals on the bottom, and they're called bivalve coffins. They're made out of wood and they open like a clamshell. That's why they're called bivalve coffins. And initially the decoration on the bivalve coffin takes some of this very feathered winged decoration that came from the cartonages and kind of carries that forward. But eventually, as the 25th and 26th dynasty progresses, the decoration gets more and more text heavy, and this is based on kind of a rediscovery of old texts and an updating of these old texts to go with the current funerary belief. And so it becomes, for the first time, using text to decorate your coffin and surround your body with becomes very popular. And so towards the end of the 26th dynasty, we have these coffins that are almost entirely decorated with text, and they have these gods that run around the outside of the coffin that kind of form this protective cordon around the deceased. And so you can imagine the deceased in the center of this tableau with these protective deities all around them, and they're surrounded by the things these deities are saying. So, and actually these last coffins are very, the ones we have mainly date from the 26th dynasty, but they're hard to date after that. We don't really know what happens after that, because Thebes stops being, during the Persian period, Thebes stops kind of being quite as important, and we don't have very many burials from Thebes. So it kind of becomes hard to date coffins from anywhere after the 26th dynasty until we get back to the Ptolemaic period. So that's the Theban model. But what's been often neglected is everywhere that's not in Thebes. And the Theban model often gets extrapolated to other places, and some scholars have even proposed that pattern books were made for decorating coffins and were sent out from Thebes to the provinces, and the provinces dutifully copied the designs from them onto their coffins. But the problem is that the coffins that we know come from the provinces, and we have quite a few of them, don't really fit the Theban typology a lot of the time. And this kind of leads to these pieces as being dismissed as provincial, or another one I've heard is folk art. That as if they were somehow cheap imitations of a Theban ideal. And I know that I have kind of undermined my own argument that they're not cheap imitations of a Theban ideal by placing this picture in my slide here, but he's very sad to be stereotyped, this mummy. Anyway, so the truth is we actually know very little about the people who made these coffins. And the styles that they were creating, and but it's increasingly clear that such regional styles actually existed. But we don't know where the artists who made them worked, or how they were trained, or whether they were literate, and we don't know whether they were attached to a temple, or whether they made coffins as a kind of side gig, like they did at Deir el-Medina. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But after having looked at a lot of coffins from provincial, from the provinces, especially Akhmim, I kind of started to come to the conclusion that maybe treating these coffins as if they are somehow derivative of the Theban tradition, instead of belonging to their own tradition and being an expression of localized religious beliefs, is maybe incorrect. And maybe the people who made them were actually sometimes literate and were religiously trained, and were able to serve their own communities. And so that's one of the things I'm going to be trying to convince you of today. And in fact, if you look at this very sad fellow right here, if you look at the vignettes on him, he's actually very well painted. And it's very innovative. So the city of Akhmim is actually a really good place to study provincial coffins, because we have a very large number of pieces that are supposed to be from there. Its 3 large cemeteries are situated about 200 kilometers to the north of Thebes in the 9th Upper Egyptian Nome. And the city is home of the male fertility god Min, and his consort is Isis, and she is also worshipped at the Min temple. And it was an important city from Egyptian prehistory down to late antiquity. And it's also thought to be source of a large number of coffins, and that would present an excellent opportunity to study region coffin style. Thought to be the source of a large number of coffins is kind of the key word there, because the problem with Akhmim, and what makes it a problematic source, is that it was heavily looted in the 1880s. The site was discovered, quote, discovered by Gaston Maspero in 1881, who found some people using animal troughs that were really using sarcophagi as animal troughs. He had been looking for the source of antiquities that were going onto the market. And he discovered all 3 cemeteries of the site of Akhmim. And basically he put his Rice in charge, and he left. And the site, basically he just sent his agents down to collect the pretty inscribed antiquities from the site, and a team of people working in his name were left working there for the next 10 years, and they kind of plundered and destroyed the site. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, news of the find and how many coffins were coming out of the site, how many mummified bodies were coming out of the site, was making scientific magazines like Nature magazine. And so people from all over the world were agents from museums, and treasure hunters were sending people to Akhmim, and people were doing their own freelance excavations. And a lot of them had permission to do it, but a whole lot of them did not. And really, permission is the only real difference between their practices, because they all completely plundered the site looking for treasure. And so Akhmim's 3 cemeteries were systematically plundered over the next 10 years. And archaeologists like Petrie considered after the 1880s that Akhmim had been completely picked clean. And there are several apocalyptic narratives about just walking around at the site and just these gaping holes in the ground with like body parts laying. It's a very sad story. And there's this picture of some people illustration of people looting some coffins in this picture here. Coincidentally, this looting of Akhmim happened during the Gilded Age, and when we had a lot of American tycoons and British rich people and European rich people who it was very popular for them to go to Egypt and buy a coffin and take it home and show it off to their friends, or show their philanthropy by donating it to their local museum. And so the objects from Akhmim ended up getting dispersed all over the world, and often they ended up because they were going through the collections of these tycoons and kind of local industrialists, they ended up in a lot of library collections and local museum collections where they're the only Egyptian object in the collection. And they're dispersed just basically any big city in the world. Anyone who had a rich person probably has a coffin from Akhmim, sadly. The site was generally ignored by scholars until the epigraphic expedition of Naguib Kanawati in the 1880s re-excavated a lot of late Old Kingdom tombs from there. And this exhibition also unearthed the only Third Intermediate period finds from Akhmim to have a find context. He found some fragments of coffins in his late Old Kingdom tombs. More recent salvage excavations by the Egyptian government have discovered surprising new material from the Ptolemaic cemetery. And these new excavations, and actually one of them just came out a few days ago, found something at the cemetery of El Diabat. They found a new tomb that is Ptolemaic. So it seems like the Akhmim cemeteries still have more things to discover. And I'm really looking forward to the Egyptian government and then the field school that found this new tomb publishing it. But the problem is, with the result of the systematic plunder in the 1880s, and with the exception of Kanawati's finds and barring any future publication of the Egyptian government's finds, absolutely nothing from Akhmim has a find context. So there are a lot of coffins that are thought to be from Akhmim, and the ones that have the best provenance can be traced back to Maspero's excavations in the 1880s, but that's as good as the provenance gets for Akhmim usually, and most of the time they don't know where it came from. And we're reliant on museum records, which can be often a little bit faulty. So how do you go about studying a corpus from a large corpus from a site that has no find contexts for anything? And one way that I thought when I first started this project that I thought might be possible was to approach it through the lens of a workshop, which is a group of craftsmen who produce objects in a similar style. Now, we don't actually know a whole lot about how ancient Egyptian coffin makers worked. Our sources on them are pretty much limited to documents from Deir el-Medina, the workman's village who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And they left some notes on how they did stuff. And they seem to have made coffins for the elite public as kind of a side job, and to kind of pad out their income. So we have several receipts from them that says that they received materials and so much money in trade, not money, but so much goods in trade to make a coffin for a client. And we have several records from them. But we have to remember that the Deir el-Medina artisans are a very specialized community. They were directly employed by the government to build tombs for the kings. And so their goods would have been very highly sought after for that reason. And so when we talk about Deir el-Medina, we're probably not talking about typical coffin makers, although sadly, that's kind of the only record of coffin makers we really have. The other records that we have are from Ptolemaic Memphis, and they don't talk about coffins much. We know that there was a mummy mask painting enterprise attached to a temple in Ptolemaic Memphis. We have some tax documents from that. And we know that there were a few traveling artists who were painting coffins. But what we do know from these documents from Memphis is that carpentry and decoration were probably executed by different people. And we know this from the Deir el-Medina documents too. People go to different places to get a coffin fabricated than they do to get it painted. And that production of funerary goods was probably not a full-time job for these people, because again, with the funerary goods, it's the very, very elite. And so I don't think these people would have gotten enough work from just coffins to put food on the table. But knowledge from Memphis and Deir el-Medina is not necessarily knowledge from Akhmim. And what we have from Akhmim is basically what can be observed from the objects themselves. So the idea of my study was basically to look at these pieces from Akhmim that have a better provenance, because some of them have a better provenance than others. So get a list of all the coffins from Akhmim, go through them and look and do research into the provenance on each of them. And if the coffins can be traced to the original Maspero expeditions, or if the owner of the coffin has a title that only occurs at Akhmim. And often the title is, they're a functionary in the temple of Min, Lord of Akhmim, and it'll actually name the city on the coffin. I'll consider those coffins to have good provenance for Akhmim, that is. And so this is my core group, these coffins with the good provenance. And I went through the core group and basically compared the text, the layout of the coffin, which is usually what's used to make typologies. A lot of the typologies on the Theban coffin focus on how many registers there are, what the layout of it is, how low the collar is. So for my typology, I actually worked from the bottom up. I looked at the layout. I looked at the actual contents of the vignettes and texts and where each one was placed on the body. And I built what I call a design pattern, which is basically a list of the vignettes that occur in a group of coffins, where they occur, the texts that occur, where they occur, and the general layout. And it turns out that a lot of these coffins share these details. And so these design patterns can act as types in a typology. And then for each coffin, I would compare the handwriting and art style over the surface of a single piece to determine how many hands worked on the piece. And then I'd compare handwriting and art style between pieces to determine which ones were by the same artists and scribes. And then I'd compare unprovenienced pieces with provenienced ones to see if I could maybe say, okay, this unprovenienced piece does not have a good collection history, but it's by the same artist and scribe who did this piece that does have a good collection history. So these pieces probably both came from Akhmim. And the goal of my project was to basically build a new typology for Akhmim and to show that this corpus is, there is a coherent local style happening at Akhmim. Yeah, my initial goal was to, if there was, to show what it was and to define this local style. And also to learn a little bit about the artists and how they worked on these coffins, because again, like we don't know a lot of details on the actual people working on provincial coffins. And the end goal is basically to show, to prove or not, that these provincial artists were working on their own style, expressing their own religious beliefs, and they were actually trained, and they were not simple provincial artists who were copying people in the capital. So how did I go about doing this? Because I had a lot of coffins to go through. So what I did was I built my own custom software to build comparative image libraries, orthographies, and paleographies. And I'm actually going to give you a little bit of a show of that. I know the talk goes downhill the minute somebody starts talking about their database. But this is cool, I swear. If I can get it to bring it up here. Hang on just a second. I need to hang on just a moment. I need to share my other window here. All right, can you see that? Okay, so for every coffin here, I actually ended up putting it in the list. So for every coffin, I wrote to the museums and asked them to send me some high resolution pictures of it. And I used this program called makesense.ai, which is used to tag pictures for machine learning algorithms. But I didn't actually use it for that. I mainly just used it to tag pictures with. And so for every picture I translated the texts on the coffin, and I went through and selected the individual hieroglyphs. And if a hieroglyph was different than, if I already had the hieroglyph in my database for this particular coffin, I looked to see if the current example was different than the one I already had. And if it was, I recorded it too. And basically I just this tool allows you to select an area on a coffin or on a photograph and to associate that area with a label. And so I would label it with the name of the hieroglyph and then export it, and it would save off a group of points that was associated with the label. And when I was done doing that for a particular coffin, I would run a script. And here I'll show you an old friend here from the Rosicrucian Museum. So if anybody's been to the Rosicrucian Museum, this piece here is an Akhmim coffin. It is located both upstairs and downstairs and is about 15 different pieces. And it was one of the first works that I worked with. And I would run the script, loading all of those files that got saved off from makesense.ai. And the script basically cut out the glyph from the picture, associated it with the Unicode hieroglyph, and I could use it to and inserted it in the database. And so I ended up with individual paleographies for each coffin, like this one right here for the Rosicrucian Museum piece. And this just shows what all the different hieroglyph examples look like. For the seated man hieroglyph, I found several different variations over the surface of the coffin. And so then I would go look at those and see where they were occurring on the coffin and see if the places where they were occurring made sense for a second hand. So in the end, I looked at this seated man glyph and I kind of decided it was just kind of the same way of drawing the same thing, although some of them are a little bit sloppier than others. So I decided these were not really proof of 4 different hands on the coffin. And generally the rule that I assumed was that I assumed that one person was working. I was very skeptical about multiple people working on the same coffin. And so to conclude that multiple people were working on the same coffin, variation had to occur in a contiguous area, and it couldn't be explained by the fact that the variation was occurring in an area that was hard to reach or that was not very visible at the funeral. For example, I found that the handwriting on the back of a lot of coffins is very squiggly and rough. And I suspect that's probably because the back of the coffin was not really seen during the funeral at all. And it was maybe the last part that they did, and they were usually in a hurry, or they weren't too concerned about it. They just wanted to get the text down so that it could be functional for the deceased, but they didn't want to make it pretty. And so areas that were hard to reach and areas on the back where usually the quality was different. And so I had to be sure not to count handwriting that was the same but a poor quality as a second hand, if that makes any sense. So I would do this for each different coffin, and actually I did orthographies as well. So I went through every word on the piece and record how they spelled it, multiple spellings of the same thing, and kind of took all of that into account when I was trying to decide how many hands had worked on a coffin. And then I went and I built a comparison. I built comparison charts for it. So, and this is going to be slow because it always is. But for all of the coffins in a group, I could go through and just compare the way the same glyph was written, and the software would allow that to appear and allow for the easy comparison between the same glyph on multiple pieces. And anyway, oh, there it comes. Okay. So basically, this is all the coffins in my corpus, and it'll show how a single character is written on each one of them. And you can filter it, but you can tell it to compare specific pieces next to each other. I can show the ones we'll be talking about in a second here. And so, yeah, this kind of allowed for the easy comparison between pieces. So that's enough of that. Let me see. Back to so basically that allowed me to do the comparison. And so just to show kind of how this worked for a particular example, I'd like to go and visit an old friend here. And this is Mr. Uefa, whose coffin is in the Hearst Museum. He's kind of the coffin that got me interested in this project, because I felt that he was very similar to some Akhmim coffins, but I couldn't say how. This coffin was purchased by George Reisner for Phoebe Hearst in the first decade of the 20th century. And it belonged to a man named Uefa, whose father's name, as far as I can tell, because it's only written twice on the coffin and it's spelled differently both times, was Kashuti. And it's an unusual looking piece, and the closest analogs are all from Akhmim, but its relation to these other pieces is unclear. And just to illustrate this, and so I'll talk about what group A is in a second, but there are these other coffins from Akhmim that have better provenances. These belong to people who worked in the Temple of Man. The one in the middle is from Leicester, and the one on the left is from Lisbon. And you can see how the one from Lisbon and the one from Leicester are quite similar to each other in the color and just the spacing in the picture and the elements in each one of the vignettes. They all have the same vignettes in the same order. But the one at Berkeley is just different. The colors are different, and it's not just because of the pictures I've taken. The colors really are different on this piece. The canopic jars under the bed are different. And also, if you look at the trees in each one of these, so previous attempts to define this group of coffins honed in on this picture of Osiris in the branches of a tree, which is really unusual, and it doesn't occur outside of Akhmim on coffins. But previous attempts to define this type of coffin have always mentioned, first of all, the tree is always growing out of a little bit of a pot. And you can see that best on Pabasa's coffin at the bottom here. It has this wide kind of planter that it's growing out of. And it has these two obelisks on either side of the coffin. And if you look at on either side of the tree, and if you look at the Berkeley one, it doesn't. And Isis is in the tree with Osiris, which she's not on these other two. So the Berkeley coffin actually has kind of a thicket of trees, no pot, no obelisks, and Isis is standing there with Osiris inside the trees. So it's clear that the Berkeley coffin is not by any of the same artists who were working on the well-provenanced coffins from Akhmim. So my quest became to kind of like figure out how exactly does the Berkeley piece fit in, because I can't say it's from Akhmim unless I can associate it as being by the same artist who did a piece that we know is from Akhmim. So I went over this, I studied the surface of it, and I just came to the conclusion that a single artist had done all of the art on the Berkeley coffin. And you can tell this, when I was doing this, I discovered it's best when you're doing these comparisons to look at the faces of the women, the goddesses, and also the animals, because they don't change. The animal faces are drawn the same way each time by the artist. They don't change based on the accoutrements that the figure is wearing. With the female figures are usually wearing the tripartite wig. Male figures can or cannot have beards. They have a variety of different wigs and crowns they can wear, and all of these alter the way the artist drew the face, making the male figures not very good for comparison. Some of the other elements that appear in the scenes that are not very good for comparison are very simple figures. So it has to be kind of a complicated figure that you're comparing, and they have to draw it over and over again. And in this case, the best figure on this coffin to look at the art, to compare the art style, was this falcon who occurs on the head of the coffin and once in just about every register. And you can see he's got a very flat bottom of his beak. He's got a sharply down curving beak that just kind of curls over in this long, sharp kind of talon at the end of it. He's kind of got a bug eye. And he's got a very pronounced lower beak, and the upper beak is a triangle, a very clear kind of an equilateral triangle shape, which doesn't show up, which is not always characteristic of the way these birds are drawn on every coffin. And so if you look at these bird faces, you realize that each one of these is probably by the same person. And if we consider that the scribes, the artists probably were not drawing different parts of the same vignette, if we say that any vignette in which this bird occurs is probably by the same artist, then we can say that almost all of the art on this coffin is by the same artist, because this bird appears almost all over the surface of the coffin, and it doesn't make any sense to divide up a single scene into multiple artists. And actually with this coffin, and I remember last time when Marissa was here, she was talking about how it's hard to tell if the illustrator and the scribe were the same person. And with the coffins, it actually is possible to tell sometime that the artist and the scribe were the same person. And this is one of the coffins where you can. There are multiple types of script that appear on coffins. One is this very monumental script that has the outlines of the characters and they're colored in. And I'm calling them monumental because they're it's like the characters that you'll see on like a monument or something. They're very nicely detailed. And then there's this cursive linear hieroglyph that they use for more of their writing. And more quick inscriptions, and it's not quite hieratic, and it's not as detailed as the monumental glyphs. And these monumental glyphs, because they kind of live in kind of a halfway zone between because there's not really a strict dividing line between ancient Egyptian art and ancient Egyptian writing. These monumental glyphs kind of live in this kind of liminal space between art and writing. And you can kind of use them to bridge as a way to tell who did whether the same person did the art and who did the writing. So with the coffin of UFA, you can look at the two squatted man glyphs. The one on the right is the monumental version, and the one on the left is a linear version. And you can see that they're by the same person. One's just a little faster than the other, but the faces are the same. They've got that same little kind of goofy square beard. You can really tell it with the guys that have their hands in the air because they're exactly the same shapes. They have no hips or torso. Their legs go all the way up to their arms on both of them. And they have this kind of nubby little face and these overly proportioned large arms. So it's pretty clear that the person who executed the monumental glyphs on this coffin also executed these linear glyphs in this Book of the Dead spell on the coffin and on the rest of it. But with this coffin, you can also tell that the person who executed those monumental glyphs executed the drawings on the coffin as well. And one of the best ways to tell this is, again, looking at the animal heads. There's a glyph of a cow head that shows up in the offering formula. And then if you look at Hathor's face, they're the same face. And these geese, this goose head right here has this kind of blunt bill that's just bisected by the opening of the mouth instead of being kind of slightly thinner at the bottom. And this vulture in the scene of the foot has the same bill as the head in the goose glyph. And elsewhere on the coffin, there's a two-headed goose figure, and it also has this bill. So it's clear with this coffin that one person was responsible for all of the decoration on it. And if we look at the outer coffin of UFA, it's actually by the same guy. We can compare the glyphs. So one person did all the executed all of the drawing and art on the inside, on the inner coffin and the outer coffin of this set. So this is all well and good. And actually, we'll get to this a little later, but having one person execute all the elements in a set was not unusual. But our job was to tie this piece to Akhmim, and I couldn't find a piece that was from Akhmim that tied it, that was by the same artist as this piece. And then I found this old picture on eBay, which has this caption at the bottom of it. It says, Type de cercueil en bois d'Akhmim, which I murdered the French there. Sorry. But so type of wooden coffin from Akhmim. This picture was taken at the Giza Museum, which the Black Museum, where the items from the Egyptian Museum were stored in the 1880s and 90s, flooded. And there was about 10 years where everything was moved to a palace at Giza. And a lot of these pictures were taken during that move to the palace at Giza. So there's about a 10-year window, I think it is right around the turn of the century, where this picture must have been taken. And it was taken close enough to the discovery of Akhmim that they probably actually did know where these pieces came from, and they had to have actually been from Akhmim. And this coffin on the right here, if we look at it, it's by the same artist who did UFA's coffin. So here we have the branches of the tree here. Again, on both coffins, we have this thicket of trees. On both trees, there are fruits, and the fruits are kind of adhering to the top of the branches. You can see that on both pieces. Isis is standing with Osiris in the branches of the tree on both pieces. And then the leaves on this tree are stamped. It's like they took a stem and they cut the stem in half and they dipped it in paint and just used that to stamp out those leaves. And that's a real feature of the coffin of UFA, and you can see the person on this coffin did it too. And if we look at this vignette with the mummification scene here, we have this Anubis who has this, he's got a very long eye. He's got kind of a goofy look on his face. It's very triangular snout. His ears are black. They're the same color as his wig. They're not sticking out of his wig. It's like they're a part of his wig. And he's got these stiff arms. And we look over into the picture in the version of this vignette on this coffin in the old picture. Stiff arms. His ears are part of his wig. He's got this long eye. And even more fun are these wine jars underneath the mummification bier. And if we look at the other coffins, these actually, so if we look at these coffins, they've all got like actual canopic jars underneath the bier. And then UFA has the wine jars. So you can see that one of the fun features of this group is how the canopic jars change. And the wine jars show up in this old picture too. Unfortunately, although I am pretty sure that this coffin in the old picture did come from Akhmim, it belonged to a man named Iret Horu. I can read the glyphs enough to tell you that. But then again, everybody at Akhmim was named Iret Horu. And so it's been impossible for me to track down this coffin in the picture. And so if you know where this piece is, I would dearly love to know, because I would love to look at the art further. I'd love to translate it. The glyphs look gnarly. And yeah, I would just, it's been one of the enduring mysteries is, where is this piece? It was in Cairo at the turn of the century and nobody knows. So there is another possible provenance contemporary, another provenance piece that is related to UFA. It's this coffin belonging to a man named Ankh-Pakered, which is now in the Asti Museo Civico-Archeologico, which I probably also just murdered the pronunciation of that. It's in a bit rough shape, but if we look, it also has an Osiris in a tree scene, which I drew here because no matter how hard it is to see it in the drawing, it's harder to see it in the photograph. It also has this vignette of Osiris in the tree. It also seems to be a thicket of trees. Isis is standing behind Osiris and holding up his crown. You can kind of see a little bit about that there. I don't think you can see my pointer. Maybe I can draw it here. Yeah, see his crown there? There's her face right there. And she's holding up his crown. And then it also has these kind of like, it looks like a celery stem where the artist just cut it and stamped all the leaves. So here again, we have an artist who's drawing Osiris in a tree with Isis. It's a big tree. He's stamping the leaves. I don't think this is the same artist who did UFA, but they might have been working close together. And this piece also has a decent Akhmim provenance because the owner has a title in the Temple of Ninadipu. So, oops, sorry. So looking into this group a little bit closer, this is actually a group that has been known for a long, this group of coffins with the Osiris in a tree pattern. It's actually, there was a typology written for Akhmim coffins in the early 2000s by a scholar named Ruth Breck. And Breck's typology is, I used it a little bit to find pieces for my work, but it's not, it includes a few pieces that are probably Theban in their provenance. The museums had bad provenances for them. And so it doesn't really make any good conclusions about the period prior to the Ptolemaic period. She does define this group of coffins in a tree. I mean, this group of coffins that has Osiris in a tree. But taking a second look at this group of coffins, I actually came to the conclusion that it's a lot more what's going on here is a lot more complicated than what Breck defines here. First off, she has this group starting in the 25th dynasty and going into the 26th. I actually found that it actually starts a lot earlier than that, because I found a bunch of cartonages that have the same decorative program and kind of adhere to the same design pattern. They have horizontal registers, and they have these vignettes, and the vignettes occur the vignettes occur in basically the same order on the cartonages. So these this group of coffins starts in the Third Intermediate period, and it probably goes all the way through the 26th dynasty. And its characterize occurs on cartonages and bivalves. And there's a common selection of vignettes. One of the vignettes is the presentation of the deceased to Osiris, followed by a vignette of the deceased being judged, and the judge is Re Herakti. And then there's a mummification scene. And then there's a scene of Osiris in the tree. And then usually there's a scene of a mummified falcon. And you can see that this piece in Detroit, this design occurs on it, and it occurs on this later bivalve piece as well. And there's also, when I started looking at these pieces, it became clear that there was also another design pattern that was being worked on by the same artists. That was a more simplified version. And perhaps this particular design pattern, you can see it to the right here. This is a coffin of a man named Dihor Yaut. It's in Budapest. And it has this central column. And then it has these decorations on the sides, and the scenes, they're not the Osiris in a tree scene or the full scenes that occur on the groups with the wide horizontal registers. They're simplified versions. They just have like main actors in these scenes, Isis and Osiris, the four sons of Horus. So there is a branch, you have this, basically it's a multi-generational workshop that's working on these. We have the artists, several artists creating cartonages, and we have one artist who creates both cartonages and bivalves, and so he bridges this divide when the cartonages went out of fashion and the bivalves came into fashion. And then we have another artist who also paints bivalves, but he starts painting these coffins that have the central column on them as well. And then we have the UFA artist, who's probably one of the last ones, and he's maybe contemporary with the artist who did the coffin in Asti. So here's a quick tour of what one of these looks like here. This is the piece in Lisbon. It has this big Abydos fetish that cuts up over the collar. It has the four sons of Horus to each side, and Horus, who protects his father, is a very important figure in Akhmim. Here's this scene of Isis ministering to Osiris with Nephthys behind her. There's this judgment scene before Re Herakti. There's a mummification scene in which the mummification person can be either Anubis or Horus. There's this Osiris in a tree scene, and then there's the scene of the mummified falcon. And this is kind of a standard program, but as time goes on, certain elements start to drop out of it and new elements get added. So with this work on the different artists, I was actually able to build a new typology for Akhmim coffins. And I was able to show that there is a there are distinct workshops working at Akhmim at two long periods of time. There is a constant local tradition that starts at the beginning of the 21st dynasty, probably goes at least to the middle of the 21st dynasty. We can't really date it very precisely, but it's probably going to the middle of the 21st dynasty. There's another tradition, which is the one with the Osiris in a tree motif. That starts in the late Third Intermediate period, probably dynasty 23. And it goes until probably the end of the 26th dynasty, maybe later. And then at the end, and then there's a period in the 26th dynasty where the rich at Akhmim are really imitating the Thebans. And so this local style seems to die out a little bit. And the wealthy people at Akhmim are getting these coffins that have the heavy texts on them. And there are a few examples of that, but then we have one of those heavy text coffins that is by the same artist who does another style that we, again, don't have parallels from elsewhere. And so it seems that at the very end of this, at the end of the dynastic period, we have again a local style emerging at Akhmim. We do have several periods of bust where it's not really clear what's going on, that there might not be a local workshop. We only have a few examples that can be stylistically datable to this time. And again, we have to use Theban typologies to get a rough idea of when things were occurring, because there are no real people in Akhmim. We don't know when they lived because we don't have other monuments with their names on them. And they don't have anything that would associate with their coffins with the regnal year of a king. But it seems like we don't know what's going on at Akhmim during the early 22nd dynasty. And between the 27th and the 30th dynasty, it's not really terribly clear what's going on there either. because this tradition of the Osiris in a tree motif seems to die out around then. And it's replaced by a bunch of pieces that are kind of sort of, some of them are doing a very text heavy and very similar to the Theban pieces, but then some of them are just kind of disparate, and it's hard to kind of figure out how they fit together. So it seems like maybe we didn't have a local workshop at these times. So from the study, I actually, as kind of the talk about UFA kind of indicated, finding that it was usually one artist and one scribe per coffin. There's only one piece, and I'll show it to you in a second, where I can look at it and say, okay, this piece was probably worked on by two people, and it probably is not a modern restoration, because there were pieces I found that looked like they were two hands, but I was pretty sure the second hand was a modern one. And so they worked in generational workshops, and the artists who worked on the coffin were actually, in the cases where we can tell, they were often also the scribes. So that was a really interesting thing to find out. Here's just a diagram of how that group A bunch kind of broke down. It's hard to read. What I want people to get out of it basically is that we have an artist who's working on both the cartonnages and the bivalve coffins. So he's bridging this stylistic divide. We have another artist that's working on, we have several artists who are working on just the bivalves. And then we have this one artist who is working on bivalves of this group A pattern with Osiris in a tree, and also working on that pattern with the bisecting middle line here, which I'm calling the lower elite design pattern. So basically what we have is a multi-generational workshop happening. This was the only piece where I could maybe see two hands on it. This is again the coffin of Dihoriaut from Budapest. You can see on the left-hand side, I want you to look at the face of the son of Horus there. Look at the Kebsenewef and Hapi, although their names are almost never right on these coffins, and they're different in different ways every time. And if you look on the right side, you can see that the drawing is a lot more childlike and almost crude. On one side, they have these carefully drafted eyes. On the other side, it's a dot for an eye. And the glyphs are the same way. The glyphs on one side are quite nicely drafted. They're a little bit sketchy. On the other side, they're just rough, especially the top few signs. And so this was the only coffin where I was pretty sure that we had two artists working on it. And it seems like one is definitely better than the other one. So it might be an apprenticeship type situation. As far as literacy goes, this was also surprising. Most of the scribes were I translated all the texts on these pieces, and most of the scribes were partially literate. There is only one example of a coffin where I can say that this person was not literate. This is the coffin of a child that's now in Germany. And you can see I've enhanced the picture with D-stretch because it's hard to see the hieroglyphs with the naked eye. But there are some hieroglyphs there. They've got the beginning of the offering formula, the name of the goddess Isis, and then some of these hieroglyphs just look made up. And this is the only coffin that I had that had pseudoglyphs on it. And so I think we can conclude that this fellow was not literate. Most coffins, the person was probably partially literate. I worked on two where the texts on it were totally unique, and I couldn't find examples anywhere else. And so this person may have been writing an original composition, or at least trying to abridge something he'd seen elsewhere. Most of these most of the coffin writers, even if they weren't really literate, could write an offering formula from memory. And so the offering formulas are usually right on a lot of the coffins. And so I think when we are evaluating literacy, we really need to define what we mean by that, because there were a lot of these guys who were, functionally, they knew what they needed to know to be able to inscribe something legible on a coffin. And they might have, and we have to keep in mind at this time, the sort of text they were writing on coffins were very archaic to them and did not reflect the language that they would be using in their everyday lives or writing in their everyday lives. It was kind of like if we were to write in Shakespearean English. what and a lot of us couldn't do it. So I actually think that there's a pretty, considering a lot of the artists and scribes were doing this, were the same people, I actually think they have quite an impressive amount of literacy. But most knew enough of what they were copying to know appropriate abbreviations for when they had to shorten words for space reasons. And if we look back at this picture of UFO's Coffin's foot, this is actually a readable Book of the Dead spell. It's pretty rough in places, and he's abbreviating a lot. If he can write things with one character, he does. But it ends up being readable, and you can, if you know what the spell is, you can figure it out. So they were literate to that level. And a lot of the times when we talk about coffins, we talk about artist agency, and how much was the artist's agency and how much was the buyer's agency, and how much was the artist just copying models. And I kind of went into this research with that question as well. What I took away from it is that none of the scenes with the same theme are identical. They're all close. And if you look at the central figures in the scene, like the two players in the exact center of the scene, those are almost carbon copy between coffins, but there's usually some differences on the peripheries. So I proposed that if models were used and the scribes were copying from models, A, they weren't models of the whole scene, and two, the scribe did not feel compelled to copy them religiously. There was a lot of choice and decision going into making these. And I think there's also creativity going into it. And just as an illustration of that, and the way that these models, the way that these scenes differ between coffins can also give us insight into the religious training of the artist. So here's the same scene on 3 different coffins by 3 different artists from this, the Osiris in a Tree group. And you can see that they're not the same scene. If you look at this picture of Horus, he's pretty much identical between the top 2. But different parts of the scene are being switched out. So the god Atum appears in the scene. Here he is in the top right one, he is a striding deity with the double crown. In the bottom right one, he is a snake with a double crown. And so the artists, even if they were copying from a model scene, they knew that Atum could take a picture of, it could take the image of a man or a snake, and they substituted them accordingly based on their own decision. And another substitution another kind of interesting thing that occurs is the person weighing the heart on this coffin on the left hand is Anubis, and you can't see him, but Horus is actually off to the side. So he's got both people are manning the scale, both gods are manning the scales on this coffin. And on this coffin, there's nobody, probably because of space reasons. Another substitution the author has made is in the top right corner, the deity right behind this, behind Reharakti, who is acting as the judge, is Neat. Well, actually, no, she's anonymous there. On the top left one, it's Neat. And on the bottom right one, it's Hathor. And the artists knew in this case that it was acceptable that both of these goddesses could function as the Eye of Re, and that's why they're standing behind Re in this scene. They're the goddess that's associated with protecting Re in this context, just like Isis is always showing up behind Osiris. And so the artists actually knew that this was an acceptable substitute to make, that they could put Neith in one scene, and that was the equivalent of putting Hathor in the other scene. And then just one little more detail I'd like to point out. In this bottom right one, which is the coffin of Ankh-Pakarad from Asti, there are these little severed heads inside the shrine that Ahmed is sitting on top of, which is kind of wild. This doesn't occur on any of the other coffins, and I'm not really sure why the artist added it. But again, this is probably, Jonathan Elias thinks this is an allusion to a particular Book of the Dead spell. I tend to think it really underscores the ferocity of the deity in this case. But it is a little creative detail that the artist has just added on this one coffin. And so I think that the virtuosity of the artists, the knowing when they can make substitutions and what substitutions they can make in these scenes, gives us an insight that they are familiar with these scenes and they know the appropriate substitutions to make because they are religiously, they're trained in their religion and they understand. Maybe they can't completely read the afterlife texts and the religious literature, but they understand what the stories are and they're well trained and they know what elements need to go into the scene to make it effective, and they express themselves appropriately. So in conclusion, for most of the post-New Kingdom Pharaonic period, Akhmim had a thriving local tradition that was independent from Thebes. During the 22nd dynasty and the late period, we see some confluence where some of the most highly ranked people at Akhmim are using Theban, are using coffins that are very similar to Theban style. But for most of that time period, the Akhmim elite were buried in coffins that reflected a local Akhmim style. And it was and they were coffins that had artistry that could equal the best of what Thebes could produce. Akhmim's artists worked in multi-generational workshops. Most coffin sets were produced by one artist and one scribe, and sometimes those were the same people. And the scribes were usually politically literate. And finally, the scribes were religiously trained, and they were creative. And that is the end of this talk. So, by the way, this is like my favorite snake ever. This is Atum the snake in that weighing scene. I had to put him in there because he's so cute. He smiles. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions on this, you can reach me at, this is my email address.
Thank you, Kia. That was a fantastic talk. And for those of us who have been following your work for many years, it's wonderful to have seen it come to fruition. We have a couple of questions, which I'll read off. And we have a comment first from Cynthia Smith, who says, the Washington State History Museum in Tacoma has the mummy of the priest Akhmim, and the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco has his son's mummy and coffin. Can you comment?
Yes, I can. You know what? I was just in Montpellier, France, and Akhmim was the star of my speech in Montpellier. I love that coffin. He's actually, when I was talking about how I think there's a local style that crops up again at the 30th dynasty, the coffin of Ankh-Wennefer and the coffin of Iset Weret in the Met Museum in New York, I think are by the same artist, and they represent that local style coming back again at the very end of the at the end of the dynastic period, going into the Ptolemaic period. So yeah, I have studied that one, and I'm currently working on a translation of the one at the Legion of Honor, which is such a fun piece as well. That guy has some interesting titles. So thank you for that comment.
Okay. Comment, what is Osiris in the tree, that vignette about? Does it have to do with regeneration?
Okay, so yes, it does. There's a whole book about this in French called Osiris and the Trees. But I don't agree with the person's conclusion, because every example of the scene they have has the obelisks in it, and so they see the obelisks as symbols of the horizon, and the tree being kind of a symbol of rebirth between the two horizons. They also interpret that scene as being reflective of a real place, the real tomb of Osiris, which they see as a mound with trees planted on it. And they kind of use the fact that the tree is in a pot on most of those coffins as kind of a indication that this is a real physical object in the real world. And so that they explain the tree is a representation of this this tomb of Osiris that would have existed in several temple complexes. I think that we probably ought to rethink that, given that about half of the examples of that scene have no pot and no obelisks. but I think we can in general say that Osiris is a very verdant, self-resurrecting god, and that the tree probably has something to do with that.
We have a question from Roberta Gardner. What pigments were used? They seemed awfully dark. And I know that sometimes, I'm adding this, not Roberta, sometimes varnish from like modern restoring can darken stuff. But what about the pigments?
So this is fun. I actually did a lot of research into pigments, and I love pigments. I think in the reason for the darkness, first of all, Egyptian blue oxidizes, and it turns black when it's exposed to various types of pollution. So the fact that it's bluer on some coffins and blacker on other coffins may just be a result of how it's been handled in modern times. And in fact, we ought to really be careful when we see dark blue and black that we don't make any conclusions about the socioeconomic status of the person on the coffin, because the piece does not look like it did originally. As far as the kind of army green color, I have a theory about that. So in the 26th dynasty, they start using a green color called green earth, which is kind of more of a muddy green color. It's more of an army green color. Whereas previously the greens that they used in ancient Egypt tended to be Egyptian blue with copper additives to turn with extra chemicals added to it to make it green. And so green was really kind of Egyptian, it was a variant on Egyptian blue. And in the 26th dynasty, they start using this green earth, which is more of an army green color. And I think that maybe some of the green differences might come from that switchover, but of course we would need like tests on the coffins that have it to show that.
Thank you. We have a question from Jeff Guto or Gutau. Has the typology of third intermediate or late period anthropomorphic coffins been published, similar to Harco Williams' book for the Middle Kingdom coffins?
So you can get Ruth Brecht's typology. I think she's got it put on academia.edu, and it is a great typology in that she lists all of the pieces out there that she found. Mine should be out, typos and all. Berkeley puts them open access. So as soon as it gets done in the Berkeley Pachinko machine, it'll be out there.
Okay, keep us posted. We have a comment, very interesting. Thanks from Anthropology at University College Cork, Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cork, Ireland. Thank you for zooming in. From Brenda Baker, fascinating work, Kia. Do you plan to carry out similar work on coffins from other places to compare regional styles?
I would actually. I would like to. I know that some of the Fayumi sites also have large corpuses. I need to figure out who's working on them and see if they would like to collaborate. But yeah, I would love to look at other sites and compare them.